Hello, and welcome to this episode of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environment, social, and governance. I'm your host, Mandi McReynolds. Today, our guest is Alison Taylor, a clinical associate professor at New York University's Stern School of Business, whose research focuses on business ethics, social impact, and sustainability strategy. She has written a remarkable book called Higher Ground that covers each of these areas and more. Well, we are delighted to have Alison with us today. So, Alison, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Let's lay the foundation for our audience. I'd like to start by talking about the evolution of the theory of business ethics that you talk so wonderfully about on social media as well as in your book, to this extended idea that responsibility is beyond profits, it's beyond shareholders, it's to a broader stakeholder group. How did we get there, and how do you specifically define stakeholder capitalism?
Sure. So we probably all know by now, in 1970, Milton Friedman writes this famous article, and he says what it takes to be an ethical business is very simple. Focus on shareholder value and don't break the law. He actually says it's ridiculous to think that a business has social responsibilities. Only a human being can have social responsibilities or by definition, ethics. That consensus very clearly has dissolved in the past 20 years or so. I think, and I argue in the opening part of my book, there are three reasons for this. The first is I think we are in a landscape of political failure and dysfunction and polarization, which has led to the general public and employees and various sorts of stakeholders turning to business to solve problems we used to rely on the government to solve. So that is one issue. We can certainly see that businesses have become far more drawn into political conversations over the past decade. So I think that is certainly one thing. The second thing I say is that transparency has become a weapon. So back in the 20th century, a corporation used to a very great extent, be able to control its reputation, to control the narrative in the public domain. Media was much more concentrated, media needed the advertising, and so you could, to a very great extent, say what you wanted to say, and there would be limited opportunity to counter it. Clearly now, with the rise of social media, that is no longer the case. We don't necessarily take a corporation's word for anything. We look at other reviews, we go on Glassdoor to figure out where to work, etc., etc. We've also, along with this sort of definitely fraught new reputational landscape, seen the rise of strategic leaking and employee voice, and employees seeking to hold corporations accountable by putting damaging, embarrassing internal information out there into the public domain. And then finally, I argue the professional has become personal. So if you are a young person, and I see this in the classroom every day, you increasingly have the idea that the corporation should adapt to you rather than the other way around. So along with that goes a lot of rhetoric about purpose, bring your whole self to work, needing corporations to represent your values, and so on. So all of this, I think, has led to the rise of what we call stakeholder capitalism. None of it is easy because these rather banal comments you see out there about having to balance stakeholder interests, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that in real life. The final thing I would say is that the Milton Friedman shareholder pressures haven't gone away. It would be one thing if we'd all pivoted to stakeholder capitalism and all kind of agreed that was the way to go. But where we are now, I think, if you're a corporate leader, is a sort of everything everywhere all at once situation where you've still got to meet those Milton Friedman shareholder value forces, but now there are all these new additional contradictory pressures. So I would argue it's never been so difficult to run a business.
Well, I think it's an interesting piece. I was in a classroom a few weeks ago and we were having this debate, and it's a piece where I often say, like, looking back 10 years ago when I taught, I used to say, like, with social media, with that change, it was this collide of your personal life being on display, but it was also this interesting dynamic of people becoming digital citizens, essentially creating their own content. And what was that going to do to today, what we're seeing is how they come into this workforce. And actually, employees are a key stakeholder now for most companies, where that might not have been the case 10 years ago. And so we're seeing this push for that capitalism. Let's double down on your comment around societal issues and everything being a priority, because I think that's one of my biggest frustrations is you've got to prioritize if you're actually going to make movement. Oh, and also, where is your business best effectively going to create change and opportunity? What are the subject areas that you have expertise and where you can have opportunity, risk, and cost for your business? How do you think, now it being the hardest time to run a business, companies should effectively set these priorities?
The prioritization point is really, really important. You just laid out in your question all the reasons why a business might want to prioritize a few environmental and social issues it can actually solve and actually address. But pretty much everything else weighs against that strategic focus. We have the rise of ESG investing, which really suggests a corporation needs to report and tick the box on 40 or 50 things. We're now seeing increasing regulatory pressure, all of which also suggests this kind of tick box approach. Plus, this general rhetoric, I think, about balancing stakeholder interests tends to result, especially among the more passionate sustainability advocates, in this kind of view that if any one of your stakeholders cares about this issue, you ought to be doing something about it. The result is very clearly out there. If we look at any leading corporation's materiality map, you will generally see an overwhelming number of issues. So you end up with this kind of glossy brochureware of these sustainability reports. Let's tell the story of all the wonderful things we're doing. It's not convincing. It's not convincing anybody. It's not convincing the public. It's certainly not convincing employees. But I think companies are kind of clinging to this idea that this is basically about PR. This is basically, if we can come up with a convincing enough narrative, we'll have a better reputation and keep everybody off our backs. It's clearly not working. The public and everybody out there has an incredibly gotcha mindset and is focused on hypocrisy. And so I would argue the kind of standard traditional way of approaching these topics is just absolutely not working anymore.
Well, I think it's interesting. Workiva is a member of the CFO Coalition for the SDGs, and every year we have to report what is our financial investment of our company towards the movement of those incremental outcomes. And I think part of the challenge that we've had is that the impact measurement isn't really defined, but then what is your financial backing or investment to that? And I actually love how the coalition and the CFOs are sort of pushing that direction, and so that you're not like actually cascading the landscape. And it brought up this really interesting dialogue, because as a software company, as a mid-sized software company, our major investment is in human capital. It's also in human benefits. It's also in the type of benefits we offer to our employees around the world. So connecting ourselves to the impact measurement of good health also correlates to the business investment that we're making as a company. And you're actually having this dialogue about, but this is the sphere of influence we have. And someone went like, well, what about vaccines over here in this country? And my response was, no, it's within the sphere of influence of our company and what we have control over to contribute to a broader impact in the world. It's not necessarily that we are a vaccine company. I love that we're seeing that collide in the market take place. And that leads me to something interesting that kind of came out in your book was you talk about this importance of external groups to manage this crisis. And so if organizations aren't a part of external groups or they aren't listening to stakeholders, we're going to really see this idea of innovation be accelerated or climate change issues being addressed. And so is collaboration the theme that we should be going after? What do you think is the important principle of collaboration when it comes to these stakeholders?
I mean, I think collaborations are very interesting. We tend to think about business as competition. We tend to think about business as maximizing our value by putting as much pressure as possible on other stakeholder groups. For example, it is traditional to try to push your suppliers to supply you as quickly as possible and for the lowest cost possible. So we focused on cost and efficiency over resilience, for example. I think the pandemic decisively proved that organizations that had more resilient cooperative relationships with their suppliers were in a much better place to withstand the kind of disruptions that we saw there. So that is just one, one example of how collaborating with your customers, employees, suppliers, etc., can help drive advantage. I think the wider point I would make is we need to think more systemically. The Milton Friedman notion says a corporation is a self-interested, profit-maximizing black box. But if we can no longer shield corporations from all these reputational attacks because of social media, if we can no longer defend shareholder value by telling attractive stories, then we need to think much more systemically. And so I think part of the conversation as well is, what are we really expecting the private sector to do versus civil society versus the government? Can we, rather than setting out kind of abstract net zero goals for 2050 that no one has any idea how they're going to meet, can we engage more actively in the policy questions? Can we make it clear that we need a supportive policy environment? Can we then, by extension, explain what we are and aren't doing to influence the policy environment? Can we, rather than suggesting that corporations need to stand up and solve all these problems, can we focus on having a more healthy representative democracy where our employees can express their political views in whatever way they want? So part of this is about collaboration, but I think there's a broader problem with kind of overreach. There's a broader problem with corporations suggesting they can solve problems that they cannot actually solve. And we end up both undermining the political process and undermining corporate credibility.
So as we think about reframing the role of business in society, you said purpose starts with impact. Can you unpack that for us as to what kind of impact then we should be discussing and talking about?
Sure. So, I mean, impact has this kind of problematic reputation because it seems to suggest that companies need to, kind of consider everything, take this very, very, very maximalist view and cannot run the business. The main point I want to make about this is there is a view that one should ground efforts in risk, and particularly reputational risk, and in how the public and stakeholders sees you. The point I would make is that by the time a risk is manifested, it's a little bit too late to do anything about it. And we can see this over and over again. Like plastic waste wasn't really an issue until there's a David Attenborough documentary, and then suddenly the public discovers that plastic waste is an issue, and all these companies come under pressure. So my point being, if you wait until a reputational risk manifests, you're far too late to do anything about it. So I say instead, think about your business model. Think about the externalities that your business model creates. Think about those negative externalities. Those are the sources of all your risks. They're the source of your reputational risks. The reason I would argue for the rise of ESG is that the public has become far more aware and far more angry about the negative impacts of business on society, climate and greenhouse gases being the most kind of obvious example. So I think rather than overpromising, focus on the negative impacts that your business is having. Make your best effort to do no harm and clean up your own mess. Treat your workers with dignity and respect, which means partly valuing your own people. You mentioned earlier that we do not value human beings in how we traditionally account. We do not value something like training. We treat it as a cost. I think if you focus on those things, that is not nearly as partisan as the ESG discourse out there. It's very defensible. Most of us agree this is how business should behave in society. And it's a lot of work. If you focus there, you will have plenty to get on with without needing to, my friend Clara Miller calls it yodeling, without needing to make empty speaking up statements on every issue every 5 minutes. Focus on the issues your business can actually address. Be clear about what those issues are. Be clear about your priorities. And then, if you've got all of that right, you can consider a more extended view of your role. But every company I've ever met has a lot more work to do there.
So I think it's an interesting notion on impact, and one of the things coming up is really how do you measure impact when it comes to people and communities. You talked a little bit about training, and often the apples to apples is the training hours that you give employees, or the types of training is what investors are starting to ask more about. I also think, one of the things that's interesting, and I think you can take great examples from businesses in higher ed, where it's like you look at what is the economic value of different initiatives that you're doing. And, I worked for a company where we looked at a major sponsorship that was a community sponsorship. It obviously had brand value, but it produced millions of revenue to our communities of which we're a part by sponsoring that local initiative. And as Workiva's gone in our journey, we've done our own economic value study, and we're exploring then, like, what is the economic value of our product to our customers? What is that return on investment? And it's a very complicated piece, because sitting at world events like COP and others, people are like, how do we measure economic value? I'm like, well, there are methods, right? There are methods to actually measuring people and communities. What do you think are some of these natural measurements that companies should consider?
Well, I think measuring, let's be clear up front, measuring impact is really difficult, especially in a quantitative way. Suppose you are, let's take a different example. You've used a very good example of something very specific from Workiva. Suppose you're a pharmaceutical company and you invest in an access to health initiative and the community's health improves. How much of that's attributable to you is a good question, right? And so there's very good work going on. I'm thinking about George Seraphim's impact weighted accounting, for example, trying to advance this kind of measurement. The approach I take is rather more simple, arguably, which is to think about your impact on human beings. So human rights frameworks would look at how your businesses impacts human beings and how direct that influence is. What are you causing? What are you contributing to? What are you directly linked to? I like these frameworks very much because, again, they consider the relative role of government and business in addressing these wider questions. This brings up another issue as well, which is deeply uncomfortable and which we never really get to discuss. But if we are, for example, a multinational business, suppose you're a multinational business operating in the cocoa industry in West Africa. As you know, that industry, for very good and understandable reasons, is under considerable reputational pressure over child labor and deforestation, constantly in the media. But if you are running one of those companies, and I'm certainly not trying to excuse lack of effort or lack of achievement, but you've got a few dilemmas. You can invest in traceability and transparency so the Western consumer feels better. You can say something like, I'm banning child labor on my farms. The uncomfortable truth is many people in the region would like their children to be on their farms and inherit their farms. This is not something that you can say as a corporation without sounding like you are approving of child labor. So then you say, I don't want the children on the farms. And then the next question will be, what would you like me to do with my children? And then before you know it, you're building schools. And then maybe you're undermining local social services and civil society and skewing the labor market. And you're opening all these very, very, very difficult questions. So we do not, I think, we're not having a healthy conversation about what is the role of business in society? What are the limits of that? Is there any end to this cocoa company's role, obligations? I'm certainly not saying it has no obligations. It is sourcing from that region. But I think we're having a conversation that is overwhelmingly focused on disclosure and audits and what companies are and aren't saying about their efforts. We're not wrestling with these bigger questions about what problems exactly are we expecting business to solve.
Well, as we think about what problems we're exactly asking businesses to solve, I find it fascinating. So, Workiva conducted a global survey, and we found that 97% of practitioners, so this was 900 practitioners working on ESG strategy and reporting in their companies, that actually had to be a part of their job, and this was global. And 97% agreed that they needed access to technology and data because it's going to play an essential role in decisions, but what you were talking about, decisions, right, to advance their ESG strategies in the future. And our CFO and I were laughing. We were together with some other colleagues around the globe, and we were saying, we're not really sure what the other 3% said. I don't need better technology or better access to data. We're not really sure where that came from. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because we see technology technology, especially at Workiva, as a way to driving better global transparency. So how do you see transparency connecting the right thing to do to tech? How do you see the technology role playing a part in the business ethics and helping companies?
Sure. So another great question. I'm certainly one of that 97% that thinks we need better data. However, part of the issue is where we're even looking. So going back to this discussion we were just having on human capital, many companies don't measure turnover, do not measure the cost of hiring, do not measure many things that might tell a different story of value than if we just treat employees as a cost and we suggest we need to get wages as low as possible. So part of the question is what we're looking at and what we're measuring what we're measuring. I suppose my bigger and more provocative point is that yes, data is important, but we also see a lot of paralysis. We also see, if you go back, Mandi, to the founding of CDP in 2000, there's this idea, here we are, we'll get companies to disclose better data on climate, and then we'll be able to move to action. 23 years later, we're still arguing about what companies should and shouldn't disclose. So I don't know that we need more and more and more precise measures of data to know we've got a big problem with climate and we need to actually do something and not just measure something. So transparency is a really interesting topic. The rise of transparency is clearly a big story here in how we have shifted our ideas of corporate accountability. We have a big piece of rhetoric in the responsible business community, which is that if we can just get companies to be more transparent, that will drive accountability. I'm not against transparency, but I would absolutely query that mechanism that transparency automatically leads to accountability, because we seem to have trapped ourselves in an argument about more and more ESG disclosure and what it will and won't do, and many companies really struggling to move to that next step, which is action. So I find your survey results very revealing, because it certainly reinforces the need for data, but what I hear implicitly is, I am struggling to move to action. I am struggling to get leaders to actually do anything. I hope if I have more data, I'll be able to make a better case. I'm not sure that data will ever build the case as much as will and a view that we really need to do something about this, courage, leadership, that kind of thing.
Well, I think it's interesting. We had a fascinating roundtable at COP, and it was kind of a closed door, which we had some customers, media, and some of the ratings agencies, as well as long-term disclosure agencies, on this notion of accountability and on this notion of we're going to hit a very interesting turn once regulation starts ticking away in 2024 and 2025 and 2026 to, oh my goodness, 2030 is coming and only 15% of the UN SDGs are on track. So where's action going to happen? Or that's where a lot of midterm climate goals are. And I think companies are going to hit in 2025 this moment of we are 5 years away. It's a little bit closer, and have we actually taken the accountable steps we need? I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier in both your writing and in this conversation we've been having together, where you talk about the employee is the most important stakeholder. And I find that really interesting. A lot of our founders and our CEOs really make it clear that, if you take care of the employee, they take care of the customer, and that takes care of then the shareholder. And in some ways outlining kind of the key stakeholder and the cascade that it has. Help us and educate us on why you see the employee as the most important and what's a great path forward or examples of this in practice.
Sure. So this conversation is very often framed in terms of labor market dynamics. And we can see in the US, labor market dynamics have really evolved. There's a relatively tight market. We have seen very clearly the rise of unions recently. I mean, something I think is really fascinating. In the classroom, and I teach in a business school, which is a feeder school for Wall Street, but I hear very, very high pro-labor sentiment, more than I have during my entire career. So we can answer the question in that way. I do not answer the question in that way. I think regardless of labor market dynamics, the rise of employee voice and strategic leaking in particular is one of the most interesting and under-discussed stories of the past decade. The undercutting of the message by employees, I think, really affects the way that companies need to show up, and it really provides this power to employees to hold their companies accountable. In the classroom, I just had a discussion last week with my sustainability class. I'd asked them to speak to 5 friends about what sustainability meant to them. These are people mostly in their 20s. And what I heard was, the answer was, I don't bother buying green products or thinking about having a shorter shower on my own footprint. I'm going to go and get a job, and I'm going to pressure the company to do something about this because I'm going to have far more impact that way. So we've started to, I think, see employees trying to push their companies to take positions on issues. So it's almost like employees have started to think about themselves like a democracy, and leaders like the electorate, and try to push leaders to speak up for them. So I think a lot of this is pretty dangerous, but that is why I say employees are the most valuable stakeholder. That also, I mean, the other thing to just kind of say here, Mandi, is we have this very weird conversation out there about companies should balance the interests of their stakeholders. Well, a company is its employees. Are employees even a stakeholder? Or, as you say, like, other stakeholders will respond to a company based on how employees are acting and behaving. So are employees a stakeholder, or are employees the business, and they are responsible for how other stakeholders will see the business? I think that is a more useful way to think about this, because we have this notion about kind of companies balancing stakeholders. But if you are a customer, you're going to be working with business development. If you're a supplier, you're going to be working with procurement. If you're employees, you're going to be working with HR. So how does the company show up in those different conversations? That's probably going to be different from the story the sustainability team is telling. And we need to think in a more holistic way about how an organization engages with its stakeholders, and not just treat this as a form of messaging by the sustainability team.
Well, and I think it's also finding the data that goes back to what are you transparently disclosing. And I share this with a lot of ESG chief sustainability officers, as well as finance teams and chief human resource officer teams. If you pull the data from your website, from your public disclosure website, we built that. As a mid-cap company with investors in mind, right? Like, to me, that seemed to be the priority audience. And I was surprised to see how wrong I was. In fact, if you follow how people move through our website, so they come to the ESG page to read the disclosure, and then the next page that they go to is our product. So it's actually a customer exploring our own practice and thinking about our product. And then the next one is going to careers. So, and then the third audience is like the investor audience. And I think that's really interesting to challenge people out there to be like, your assumption may be wrong as to who is looking at this data and information and who is actually thinking about your business, whether it's from a product side to an employment side. And your stakeholders might be a little out of order when you think of your public disclosure. So go to the data, find the data, discover the data, and then think through what the implications are for your business in that way, from a risk and an opportunity perspective. So this has been a lovely discussion, and I love how you ended the book with advice for how businesses can find higher ground. They can move up to seek something better. Please tell us more about what you think the path forward is for businesses all around the globe that tune into this podcast.
Yeah, so there's a lot of advice at the end of the book. I would just say very simply, you don't need to promise to save the world. You can run a good business with products people want to buy and provide good jobs, treat your workers with dignity and respect, make your best effort to do no harm, and that will be enough. You should, as part of that, set very focused environmental and social priorities. You should consider your impact on human beings. You should consider making that impact the source of your ethics commitments. You should think in a more holistic way about leadership. So rather than having these siloed messages coming from different departments, you're thinking across the organization about what its values are and what it's going to commit to and what it is and isn't going to say. You should measure your culture. You should be clear with employees about what you are and aren't going to take action on. You should foster more open, realistic debate. You should encourage democratic participation. You should overall, I think, put people at the center of your business and also be clear about the limitations of what you can and cannot achieve.
Thank you, Alison, for joining us today in a lively discussion, a fun discussion, and also a discussion that really talks through these critical questions about how we all achieve higher ground. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. If you're interested in learning more about Alison's research, she recently co-authored an article in Harvard Business Review about the evolving role of chief sustainability officers with Bob Eccles, one of the world's foremost authorities on sustainable business. Bob joined us in season 2 to discuss this very article, so please check out the episode. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to see future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. We'll talk soon.